look at a Telecaster? Here's one. We'll make it do some Telecaster things. This is, I'm told, a 1978 Tele that is in reasonably good shape. You know, 1970s Fender products catch a certain amount of disdain among the collector crowd, and some of that is not without reason. They started changing some stuff that maybe didn't need to change, but really, Telecasters did not suffer to the same extent that the Strat did. Things like they maintained the 4-bolt neck. In the Strat, of course, they went to a 3-bolt design, which virtually everyone and his brother suggests is inferior. There were some shifts in the wiring, for instance. They went from 250K pots to 1 meg, which can be pretty darn bright if you run it wide open, but you know, you have a tone control, and you could use it. The pot value went back to 250 in the 80s. It was only around for a decade. And, you know, earlier wiring schemes from the 50s and 60s made the neck pickup on these so dark that it was almost unusable for most applications unless you did modify the wiring, which a lot of people did. So some of these changes might have actually been for the better. People say they're heavier guitars, and that's maybe true on average, but there were still plenty of lighter ones being made. It really depends on the tree, right? There's different densities. This one is heavy, but it's not super heavy. How about finish issues? I won't say fissues. That's weird. Fender made the move to polyester starting in the late 60s, and by the early 70s everything was being done in it. And at certain points it got ridiculously thick, especially on the necks, which repair people kind of hate because refretting becomes tricky the thicker the finish. We might run into that today because that's what this thing is getting. Speaking of finish, I really don't know how to characterize this one because it's close to opaque. I'm not seeing any wood grain in there. Not really. Wear spots have a much lighter color. So is this a white guitar that aged into this? It was in a room full of smokers for 30 years and turned into this? I don't know. And on the back there's some weird stuff too. We got these dark marks here that look like the sleeve on a sweater or maybe a corduroy cushion or something. I don't know. And there's some ghostly stuff under the finish. I'll see if I can get a good angle. There are these greenish blotches that seem like they might be under the finish. Or there's certainly a component of it. And a really bizarre one, I'm not sure if it'll get picked up, but there is a kind of rectangular clean spot that looks just like the access plate on the back of a Strat. Like maybe it was sitting on a book for a long time and whatever this other stuff is didn't get affected by it. I don't know. Is this an attempt at a vintage butterscotchy kind of appearance, or maybe one of the blonde ones from the late 50s? Or is this white? I can't tell. The neck has got a kind of gentle V shape to it, which is very pleasant. There's also some bird's eye, some figure in it as well. It's perfectly flat sawn, of course. That people ask about that. Fender really didn't mess with quarter sawn necks because that's not how you buy Eastern hard maple, rock maple as they call it. It's sawn through and through. It's a commercially available timber for furniture making. This is how you buy it. And when it's oriented this way, it's pretty stable. The player has had the guitar for some years. He quite enjoys it. He does not like this fret wire. This is not the super skinny vintage wire from the 50s and 60s. It's sort of the medium thickness. But it's been dressed several times, I imagine, and it's quite low at this stage. You know, this is around 20 thousandths of an inch tall, which most people start to complain about. It can be difficult to measure that on these guitars because, as I mentioned, we've got quite a layer of finish on the fretboard, and the way it was applied, Fender would install the frets, they would shoot the lacquer, polyvinyl, polyurethane, whatever it happens to be, over top, then dress off the top surface of the frets, leaving this scooped kind of effect, this buildup of finish right in the corner between the fret and the board, which makes a little hump on either side. That might actually feel good to some people, but as a repair person, it's just a nightmare. So we'll see what we can do. String action, which I measure at the 12th fret, regardless of the guitar, is just over 4/64ths on the bass side, and also just over 4/64ths on the treble. Neck relief. Fender spec for these guitars would be about 10 thousandths, and that appears to be close to what this is. This might be 9 thousandths. We're not going to complain about that. Got one little area here at the 4th fret where there's a crack in the lacquer and we're missing a chip. We can see what kind of film it is. It does really peel up more like plastic than classic lacquer does. It doesn't chip off, it kind of falls off in sheets. So we're going to put some super glue under that as well, try to hold that all in place. These edges are kind of sharp and it wouldn't take much to grab a hold and knock off a whole big chunk. I'm going to take the neck off, which is not something I always do with these guitars, especially when I don't have to adjust the truss rod. But in this case, because the guitar was made before 1985, the frets in these were installed sideways. It's a topic that we've covered before, but I'll do it again. Fender had an interesting, well, it's very unique method of installing frets that goes right back into the 50s, where they had a device that kind of clamped down over top of the fretboard and pulled the frets in from the side, from the bass side towards the treble. So the barbs on the tang of the fret wire travel along under the surface of the board rather than getting forced down through the top of the slot. And if we try to remove these in the usual fashion, often it causes great damage and a lot of annoyance and trauma. So this has got a rubber seat or kind of a gasket. We're going to be careful when we pull that off as well. Okay, we have paint witness lines. And it's very much lighter in color than what's going on the surface. So yeah, I think this was originally a much whiter looking guitar. Here we have a sticker with a number of different initials and QC stamps on it. Unfortunately, in this era, there is not a date stamped on the end of the necks. So we're relying on the serial number to do the work. Interestingly, there's a thin piece of tape which is over top of the end of the truss rod cavity here. You can see there's a little hole, and I suppose maybe that was in place to originally keep the finish from going down into that hole. However, if that was the intention they missed, I don't think it's thick enough to be like a reverse shim or something like that to change the neck angle. It's too thin for that. It's just interesting, that's all. Here's the neck pocket, again with a whole lot of stamps and initials, and what might be the original color. There's a stamp there which could be 78 or 79, which may be a date. So this is an important part of the procedure. If I don't do this, I'm really tempting fate. I've got to scribe along the sides of each fret and cut through that film finish. Sometimes I like to heat the fret up. If it's really thick, that can help slightly soften the finish. Other times it doesn't seem to be necessary. So this is an old 15-watt soldering iron. And I've ground a little recess into the tip that kind of hugs the top of the fret. You don't want this thing to touch the top surface of a maple fretboard, because it'll leave an indelible mark. And this is not just heating the fret, it's heating the finish adjacent to it, softening it and making it more amenable to being cut. And again, don't slip with the knife. I got to make sure it's a nice precise cut. Concentrate. Oftentimes there'll be a buildup of some finger grunge or schmutz in the corner there as well. So I'm angling the blade inwards under the fret wire, and this is part of the reason why it costs $50 more for me to do this kind of fret job. I must remove the tuners so that I have a flat surface upon which the headstock can rest. I have some well-padded clamping cauls. I'm using a Dremel with a cut-off wheel to make a little nick in the surface of the fret close to the end. Then using a small sharpened punch and a hammer, I'll knock the fret out sideways. Again, don't slip with the punch for obvious reasons. So I'll get after all the little areas of chipped finish around the board with some thin cyanoacrylate glue that will wick in and also fill in any larger surface area. Here's another big missing patch right on the corner. I want to put stuff on that because the more we fool with the ends of the frets, the more it could loosen. So this will take a number of coatings. I've got a fresh single edge razor blade. I'll put on a couple of tape guards on either corner. I'll use that to level the CA glue. This action is quickly hindered by the deposit of finish alongside of either fret. It's not allowing the blade to get down close to the surface of the fretboard. You can see that it rocks on the little hill there, so I've got to come along and do this for every fret. Scrape that area down, trying to be as delicate as possible because this finish, being what it is, could want to pull up. And again, if I don't do this, the frets are not going to sit level. The frets we're going to be using are slightly larger, slightly wider than the previous ones, so this has to be a fairly flat surface for them to seat against. I'll scrape and sand the areas along the edge which are missing. I can buff that up to a sheen that resembles the rest of the neck. Trying to install lengths of straight wire into a vintage style Fender fretboard with a radius of 7 1/4 inches would be very frustrating. So we use the fret bender here, which as you can see has got a little channel for the fret tang to ride in. It can be quite surprising the first time you do it just how tight a radius 7 1/4 is. It's important to clean the wire before using it because there's always a layer of grease from the manufacturing process. Because of the thick layer of finish, that 7 1/4 can be approximate too, and it can vary across the board. I'll snip off a length of wire for each fret position, being a little bit generous. They're about 1/8 inch oversize. To clean out the fret slots, I'll use my fretting saw, which has an integral guide. I have to make sure that it's set to something just deeper than the actual depth of the tang, which varies from fret to fret because of the vagaries of the manufacturing process. Sometimes it's 1/16 of an inch, 62 thousandths. Sometimes it's 72 thousandths. The saw blade is a snug fit in the channel. And you see that kind of rocket to keep it aligned with the radius of the board. Squeeze in a little fish glue. I'll tap in the ends and give it a squeeze with my fret press. The frets over the body here I'll just tap in the old-fashioned way with the hammer exclusive. I'll use my end nippers to remove the ends by nipping them and catching the remaining little pieces because I don't want those to go too far. The first couple of passes with the chamfering tool have to be quite delicate because they don't all stick out the same amount to begin with. Helps to turn the neck on its side so I can see precisely where that chamfer is ending. I don't want to file off the finish on the corner of the neck. So I also have to remove the tiny little bit of material which is protruding here on the tang. I have a tiny little file for that. I'll also do some drop fills with CA glue on the end of each fret. Some people forego taping up fretboards, but I can't see how you can do this properly on a finished neck like this without taping it up, especially for the recrowning procedure. So I'll use some marker on the tops so I can see what I'm doing. My leveling beam. This removes very little material. Over the fingerboard extension, as it were, the part that's above the body joint, I'm going to put in a little bit of fall away too. This can help to achieve a lower action if you want a lower action. Polishing, polishing, polishing. Actually, at this point I'm rounding. I'm knocking the corners off with some 600 grit paper on the finger, which conforms nicely to the shape of the fret tops. And I don't know, it works fine for me. You know, it's Sunday morning as I'm doing this. Sunday morning coming down. And it strikes me that I realized in the last 3 or 4 days, I think every single guitar repair content creator has released a video featuring a fret job. You know, we are all part of one great big evil society, but we should have got our plans together a bit better. You know, how can we dominate all the content if we're all doing the same thing? It's just something that happens every once in a while. Like, if you're a fretted repair person, you're going to be working on frets a lot. And I try and keep it sort of interesting with other jobs, but I spend a lot of time doing this, and so does everyone else, so sometimes it's unavoidable. Now I'm onto some 1200 grit, and I'm working, rather than across the frets, I'm working in line with them, which seems to give me a better polish. And again, there are different ways of doing this. Everyone has their own methods. As long as it works, I don't care. Rather than using a backing block of some kind, people like to use like erasers or just little sanding blocks with various materials. I just use my thumb, and it helps me sort of wrap around and get into the corner. There are people who ask why I don't just use a buffer on them, and well, you got to understand that this part of the procedure has to happen regardless, whether you use a buffer or not, because the leveling scratches are deep enough that you're not going to buff through them unless you're sitting there for a very long time, inhaling buffing dust, which I don't like. So it takes me a couple extra minutes to do it by hand. I do it by hand. Some 2400 grit micro mesh, which is an abrasive that's bonded to a rubber backing, so it conforms really well to shapes like this. Lasts a long time and is exceptionally good at polishing things. The question becomes, like, how much of this do you want to do? Like, to be honest, this doesn't need to be buffed. This is smooth enough for play. It's smooth enough than most factory guitars as they leave the factory. And much of this is just because people want to see really shiny mirror-like frets. It's not really necessary. It's within 5 or 6 hours of play, this is all gone. It doesn't last. But sometimes we do this stuff because it's what we do. At this point, I'll work on the fret ends. They need to be shaped and then sanded as well so that they're also brightly polished. I'm not sure if this is the original nut or not. Some features suggest that it might be. Regardless, I'm going to try and, continue using it. It might feel kind of paradoxical, but sometimes, even though we've raised the height of the fret wire considerably, when you think of the entire scale length, the distance between the first fret and the nut is such a small percentage of that. And because we're also going to be raising the saddle about the same height as that we've raised the fret, we can oftentimes get away with using the same nut. One little thing here is that it protrudes rather a lot on the bass side. It's pretty flush on the treble, but it's sticking out on the bass. I'm going to try and clean that up a little bit. Oh, how they gleam. I adjusted the action to 4/64 across all strings, and didn't quite make it. There's another reason to change this nut as well. I noticed a small crack right beside the B string. Now, depending on how solidly this is glued in place, that might or might not be an issue. However, it's not a good look, so I think it's probably time to change it. I'll cut through that giant snow pile of lacquer on the corner of the nut on both sides. And this was not glued in, which is good. They don't have to be, as long as they're good and tight. And this came out in multiple pieces, which is not uncommon for old nuts. I made a new blank out of bone, scribed it to length. I used a half pencil to scribe a line for the depth of the fret slots. I need to add a little margin over top of that, about 30 thousandths, using a radius gauge to scribe that new line, which will be the top of the nut, almost. I'll cut to that line. I'll mark out the outside string spacing. I used 3 millimeters to the center of the string slot. And I'll grab my Stuart McDonald string spacer. This is the proportional one, and I'll fill in the other 4 string slots. I'll make the positions more official by scribing them with a knife, and then use a saw. Then rough in the slots with the appropriate sized files. I'll remove most of the overburdening material. The idea being to do as much of this work as possible off the guitar, because fenders are quite difficult to slot otherwise. You just want to do a few little passes to finish them off and be ready to go. And that's another refret. Let's plug it in.